Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Aaron Espinoza, and I have the distinct privilege of being the director here at the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory, as well as the executive director of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be back on stage. I've been gone for a few weeks, but I do appreciate being here, and I've been paying attention every day via the YouTube, and I just thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community, and I just can't say thank you enough, so I'm just going to say thank you one more time. Before we dive in, please make sure we turn off our cell phones. I know we all say we were going to. I was in the middle of a courtroom the other day and did not turn off my cell phone like I was supposed to. So please, if you would. So one of the goals here at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival is to celebrate literature by uniting acclaimed authors and literary enthusiasts, fostering a community that values the written word. The festival aims to provide educational opportunities through discussion, enabling attendees to interact with prominent authors and gain insights to their creative processes. Additionally, we strive to promote community engagement and literacy, supporting emerging voices in literature, and to enrich the cultural landscape of Rancho Mirage, enhancing the region's reputation as a hub for the arts. We are committed to making our impact felt all year long. This Writers Series, along with our Writers Festival, along with all the library and observatory program, is our commitment to those impact all year long. I'd also like to acknowledge some of my team members. So first I'm going to start with our founder, Jamie Kabler, who could not be in attendance today, but we know he is here in spirits. But he, as our founder, has created such an imaginative and beautiful festival, and we just can't thank him enough. So will you please give him a round of applause? And I'd also like to give a recognition to two other individuals that are with me all year long for our festival, and that is our executive producer, Debbie Miller, and really behind the scenes, our director of programming, Deborah Deja, and our incredible team from the Writers Festival and from the Library and Observatory. This is truly a city program. I'd also be remiss if I did not thank the incredible City Council. So I'm going to ask that all the City Council stand at the same time, please. Lynn, Michael, Eve, Steve, and Ted, thank you for your unwavering support, not only for the festival, but for our library and observatory. Few cities have the level of support and the backing of the libraries, and our community is completely grateful to that. Thank you. Another person I'd like to thank is Jordan Snitzer, our sponsor of our program. He sponsors all 10 Writer Series programs, all 20,000 or 2,000 books that we offer free of charge. It is because of Jordan Snitzer. So please give a round of applause for Jordan. I know Debbie has talked about it the last few weeks, but please go onto the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival YouTube page and look at all the sessions that we have from the 2026 festival. I say 2026, but 2025 and 24 and 23. 21 and 20 aren't there because that didn't happen. But there is hundreds of videos out there for you to view. So if you have not seen some of those, please join our YouTube page. Everything is free of charge, and we are so grateful to be able to do that. As we're getting ready to wrap up the Writer Series program this season, and I want to remind everyone to join us for our last Writer Series event, which is Tuesday, April 7th, when we will welcome back Andrew McCarthy. He'll be discussing his new book, Who Needs Friends? The Unscientific Examination of Male Friendship Across America. That promises to be another enlightening discussion. I also want to mention that our partners in Follett are here with additional copies of Jim's book if you did not get one, and there are a few other copies of Jim's other book. But after the program today, Jim will be signing up at our table up here. But just as a reminder, or for those of you that are new, please line up along this wall, and we will get you over there signing as quickly as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jim Newton. Jim is an acclaimed journalist, author, and editor known for his insightful contributions to American media. He served as the editor of the Los Angeles Times and has written extensively on various topics, including politics, culture, and social issues. Jim is also the author of notable books, including biographies and historical narratives that explore significant figures and events in American history. With a background in journalism and a passion for storytelling, he continues to engage audiences through his writing and public appearances, sharing in his expertise and perspectives on contemporary issues. Jim will be joined in conversation by Justice Douglas Miller, one of the festival's favorite moderators. There are many things that Doug loves, but not in any particular order: Debbie, food, and music. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in joining Justice Doug Miller and Jim Newton.
So little did I know there were so many deadheads. So Jim, welcome to the desert.
Very nice to be here. Thank you.
This is a great place to talk about books. It's really amazing. And the varied topics that they have is just incredible. So welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library.
I'm very, very pleased to be here. A little intimidated to have the city council in the front row. I'm usually on the other end of that equation, but it's nice to have you all here too. So thank you all for being here.
And you know, I'm always looking for new facts and new things to learn from books. Little did I know that the Rancho Mirage City Council are all deadheads.
It's a rarity, but it happens, I guess.
So, you wrote a book on Earl Warren, fabulous.
Thank you.
You wrote a book on President Eisenhower, amazing. You wrote a book on Jerry Brown, one of almost as interesting as Jerry Garcia. But
darn close.
Where did the Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia come out of those three?
Yeah, it is. I'm the connective tissue between those. I think. My agent likes to joke that because I did the Jerry Brown book and then this book, that I'm only to write about Jerry's from San Francisco. No, listen. I grew up in Palo Alto. Went to high school in Palo Alto, which the Grateful Dead was very much the sort of music of my youth. Although I never have referred to myself as a deadhead, I'm sure some of you would qualify better than I would. I was a fan of the music growing up and admired it. And I actually, I'll tell a little short story on this. In 1982, I went to a show not far from here in San Bernardino County at the US Festival, which you may recall. And it was not my first Dead show, but it was at the end of a long weekend. It was Labor Day weekend. It was very hot. We were sleeping. I was with two of my best friends from college and high school. We were sleeping in the back of my parents' Pinto. It was a little grueling. But that Sunday morning, it was called Breakfast with the Dead. It's the only time I ever saw the Dead play before noon. Probably the only time Jerry Garcia was ever up before noon. But that morning, I really remember the feeling of the whole festival changing, that people, instead of sort of jostling for position and trying to get in the front row, people were giving each other water, and there was a kind of kindness that took over that morning. And I do remember that day thinking to myself, this is something worth writing about. Now, keeping score, that's like 44 years ago, so it took me a long time to get around to writing the book. But it was an idea that was sort of bubbling up in me for a long time. And so the book, I hope, kind of combines an appreciation for the music and Garcia as a person, a larger interest in counterculture, and in particularly the counterculture of the 60s, and therefore politics. So it is, in all of those senses, a fusion of my interests. It looks like more of a departure than it really feels like to me, anyway.
So I guess the next question I have is, what is it about this book that makes it something that people who aren't deadheads would want to read?
I hope a lot. I mean, it's really not written for Deadheads. I hope Deadheads like it, and so far they seem to have. But it's meant really as a look back at a cultural period in our history, a cultural period that I would argue has a lot of resonance today. There are lessons, I think, to learn from the counterculture and the way the counterculture unfolded, the effect that it had on society, on civil rights, women's rights, the environment, war in Vietnam, of course. And so I think that the story of Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead runs through the book. Of course, it's at the center of the book. But it's also meant to be a way of looking at all those other issues. Someone once said to me that the only place in the 1970s that you could have gone to and meet a Hell's Angel and a Black Panther at the same event would have been a Grateful Dead show. And that tells you something, right? They are present for so much of this period, not always the center of attention, sometimes on the periphery, but a centralizing, they would hate the word, but institution, really, of the period. So it is meant to be a book that I hope Deadheads will appreciate, but it's really meant to be a larger story of the period and its relevance today.
So I hadn't thought about this question until we were talking just a few minutes ago in the green room Jerry Garcia died in 1995. And in some sense, I think everyone would agree, he was kind of the heart and soul of the Grateful Dead. They continued on in different iterations, but why is there still such an interest?
That is a good question. Well, I start with the fact that there just undisputably is, right? The music is as popular as it ever was. There are many, many bands that cover the music itself, and then, of course, with the death of Bob Weir just a few months ago, the central figures of the Grateful Dead are now all gone. The two drummers are still alive. But I do think the music and the culture around it speak to us today. Not to everyone, of course. Jerry Garcia liked to say, when he was asked why the Dead were popular, he'd say, not everyone likes licorice, but people who like licorice really like licorice. And so, I think that the music fuses a lot of genres of American music in particular, blues, jazz, country, folk music. So I think there's a little something for everyone in it. It's a much more approachable music than people outside it sometimes think it is. The name, I think, is sort of off-putting to some people. So I think there's explanations for why the music remains as popular as it is. But also there's something about that culture of generosity and kindness and giving that is in really, I think, perilously short supply in American life today. One observation that one of the many sources for the book made to me that made a real impression on me is that we don't have a lot of experience in modern life of collective joy. That there's a lot of collective angst and there's a lot of individual joy, but there's not a lot of places that we come together and experience joy as a group. And I will say in my own life, I was there for game one of the 2012 World Series when the Giants beat the Tigers. That was one. I was there for the two Obama inaugurations. That was another experience of collective joy. And then Dead shows. And that's not specific to the Grateful Dead, but it has particular resonance with the Dead and with followers of the Dead. So that doesn't end just because Jerry Garcia dies. That yearning, that desire to be part of something that is joyful, I think is as old as Dionysus, really, if not older. So I think that it draws upon deep instincts that we have that are not easily fulfilled.
So I'm always interested in the research authors do for their book. And there must have been a vast treasure trove of information, archival information. Tell us a little bit about your research and maybe some of the people that you actually interviewed in person.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Start with yes, there's a vast trove of information. It is not easy to fish out the most interesting parts of it. It's not the Eisenhower Library, I can tell you that. There is an archive at UC Santa Cruz, which is the closest thing to a full-fledged Grateful Dead archive. It is a Grateful Dead archive. But the band members didn't keep diaries. There's not a lot of correspondence, so there are missing pieces in that from a researcher's perspective. What there are a lot of is interviews, of course. Interviews, and Garcia was a very a good interview subject, quite candid, not really seeking to promote himself or the band, usually very reflective. And so that's a real trove of material. Their business records are fascinating. The Grateful Dead was really basically made no money for the first 20 of its 30 years, or at least it spent its money as fast as they earned it. And then they became very, very rich in the last few years with a few successes. And then because they were a California corporation, there's actually minutes of their corporate meetings, which are a hoot. And then there were the interviews that I did beyond that. Too many to recount all here, but a couple of very important ones. Mountain Girl, who some of you have probably heard of. Mountain Girl's made famous by Tom Wolfe in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. She was a member of the Pranksters, and she was Garcia's, well, as I like to refer to her, his longest-serving wife.
And we'll talk. We're going to talk about the Pranksters and all that, but no, keep going.
But so she was a very helpful interview, and actually, in some ways, maybe substantively, maybe the most important interview for me might have been Jerry's first wife, Sarah, and that's for the specific reason that she helped me understand a period of his life that isn't otherwise covered by interviews, because it's before he became famous. Once he became famous, there's a lot of interviews, of course, but in the early 1960s, there was nobody interested in interviewing Jerry Garcia. So she really helped me to fill in a period between his unceremonious discharge from the Army to the sort of founding and the takeoff of the Dead and the acid test. But beyond that, I talked to Huey Lewis, I talked to Peter Coyote, I talked to Gillian Welch, some of you may know, is a wonderful artist who does very influenced by the Dead. Lots of artists, people around the band, people not the members of the band themselves, but people who worked in their business operations and whatnot. And so it took a lot of interviews. The archives are an incredibly indispensable starting place for this project, but in and of themselves, they leave some holes that otherwise had to be filled.
And I think one of the people you talked to was Bill Walton.
I did talk to Bill Walton. Bill Walton was just great. And we were talking over lunch. One of my favorite stories in the book, Walton, of course, famous Deadhead, and a very visible Deadhead, because if you went to shows, he was the tall one, right? And so you could always see him. And anyway, he wrote a memoir, and in his memoir, he said he'd gone to 850 shows or something. I forget the exact number. But he was interviewed shortly before he died, and the interviewer asked him, he said, really, 850? Come on, how many shows did you really go to? And his answer was, not enough, which I think is the perfect Deadhead answer to that question. So yes, he was not only a fun interview, but a really supportive person in this project. So yeah, it was wonderful to get to know him.
So I want to start at the beginning. And talk about his early life, because I think for most all of us here, that's kind of defining. Mm-hmm. His left some pretty serious marks, I think, on him. So tell us about his mother and father.
Yeah, his father was a musician, although didn't work as a musician after Jerry was born. He owned a bar in San Francisco called Garcia's Tavern. I forgot. I think it's Joe Garcia's. Music was a part of his growing up, but just as very young growing up with his dad. Two incidents, traumatic incidents in Jerry's young life, in back-to-back summers. I think he was 4 years old. He and his brother were playing around chopping wood, and his brother chopped the end of his finger off. By mistake, he insists. I'm sure he's not lying about that. And so when you see pictures of Garcia, you'll note that he's missing the last two digits of his middle finger. And then the following summer, even more traumatically, his father drowned. They were on a fishing trip together. Jerry and his mother and father were together. Jerry remembered seeing his father drown. There's reason to be skeptical of that. It seems like it's more likely that he was so traumatized by it that he believed to have actually seen it. But they were together on the trip when his father died. After that, he was raised sort of back and forth between his mom, who later remarried, and his grandparents. His grandmother was a really influential figure, but he did, of course, grow up without a dad as a result.
And his grandmother was a pretty interesting character. Tell us a little bit about her.
She was a great character in his life. Union organizer, very flamboyant, very sort of dashing figure in San Francisco at a time when to be a woman union leader in San Francisco was still probably would be a big thing today, but in those days especially, she made a big impression, a really positive impression. He had very fond memories of her. Not so much of his grandfather, actually, but very much of her.
So all of us here probably watched Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein.
I hope so.
I was surprised to find out that had such meaning to Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, his last real interview was when it was the movie channel was interviewing famous people about movies that made a big impression on them. And at a time in his life when he was very withdrawn and very addicted to drugs and didn't give a lot of interviews, he kind of rose to the occasion to talk about that one. And it's funny, it's not really clear why it made such a big impression on him, except that it was freshly after his father died, and I think there was something about the idea of coming back to life that was startling to him as a young child. But it was, yes, it's a movie that he saw and remembered really, quite literally to his dying days.
He talked about it all the time.
He really loved it, yeah.
So he wasn't much of a high school student, but he was
not much
lucky to get into the California School of Fine Arts. So tell us about that, because that seemed to be a change in his life.
Yeah, I think that's in some ways maybe the moment that he recognized that a life as an artist was possible. And this is a time when the San Francisco Renaissance and poetry and painting was underway. The Beats and were ascendant. On the Road came out right around the time he was at the just before he enrolled at the Fine Arts School. So all of it came together in a moment. And then he got a guitar as a birthday present. Between the idea of a life as an artist, the sudden possession of an instrument that he was fascinated by, and his discovery of marijuana, all together, this is how artists are born. So yes, that all happened right around the same time when he was living back in the city.
And he was introduced by his teacher, I think Wally Hedrick, to
a
number of interesting books from that time period, a number of interesting people, and you quickly mentioned the Beats. So that's something I'd forgot about. We've all heard about the beatniks, but there's something separate when you talk about the Beats.
It's funny. Beatnik is a word. It was actually invented by Herb Caen of the San Francisco Chronicle, and he meant it as a sort of derogatory term to make fun of the Beats. The Beats, Kerouac is probably the best known and most important of the Beats, and of course the author of On the Road, which Wally Hedrick gave a copy of to Jerry. The Beats, it's funny, there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think history has not treated the Beats particularly well. For one thing, there's a misunderstanding about the name. I think most people associate it with music. I think that the beat refers to a musical beat. It really means something more like being beaten down. And it has a much gloomier, more serious tonality than the beatnik certainly does. But those writers who were exploring new narrative forms, new ways of writing about writing, often under the influence, writing about drugs or under the influence of drugs, all of that started really in New York, but much of it migrated to San Francisco, where it found sort of common purpose with the San Francisco Renaissance, which was largely a poetry and visual arts movement. And together they formed this really important transitional moment, most recognized in literature, but also true in music and the visual arts.
So something from that book that you wrote about, On the Road, and the impact it had on Jerry Garcia, you talk about kind of from that book, rage, bewilderment, and then the word authenticity. Yeah. And that seemed to be something that stuck with him throughout his whole life. Tell us about what that meant, authenticity.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that the Beats were deliberately trying to respond to is a sense of artifice, that they were offended by the superficiality and artifice that they believe characterized the 1950s in this country, or that they were objected to. And so they saw themselves, sometimes accurately, sometimes less so, as expressing some deeper truth about themselves, an authentically true self, as opposed to artistic artifice. And yes, I think that spoke very deeply to Garcia, who just was utterly devoted to the musical form and to his art. at a cost of other relationships and aspects of his life, and we can talk more about, but that idea that he was going to be a dedicated artist to the experience of performing arts in particular spoke deeply to him his whole life, really from that moment until his death at age 53.
So something also happened to him on February 20th, 1961, a car accident.
Oh, right, yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, Jerry, there was a house in Palo Alto, not far from where I grew up, in fact, called the Chateau. It was sort of a flop house that young people were living in, and Garcia lived there for a time. A couple of his housemates and friends from the Chateau were in a car speeding home near the VA there in Palo Alto, and the car flipped, and it killed one of the passengers, a teenager who was in the car. It is the moment that Garcia would look back at that moment in later years and say that that's the moment that he felt like he needed to sort of straighten up and really make something out of his life, that he was just wasting away. He had been in the Army. It will not surprise any of you to learn that Jerry Garcia was not a very good soldier. He had left the Army to the relief of both himself and the Army, and had made it down to Palo Alto where he was performing, but he was living out of the back of his car. He was sort of stalled. And he would point to that accident as the moment that he felt like he realized he needed to get serious about his life. And so it was instrumental in kind of lighting a fire underneath him.
You have a great quote. He says, quote, "That's where my life began. That was the slingshot."
Yeah. The slingshot.
Interesting way to describe it.
Yeah.
I think in some sense, too, we all have little moments like that, but
Yeah,
that was pretty significant.
Yeah. And in some ways, maybe even more interesting that he thought of it that way, because that shows you that whether it's accurately described as the slingshot or not, the fact that he felt that it was is evidence of how profound it was on him.
So there's so much myth and lore about the Grateful Dead, and myth and lore and different stories about how some of them met, how they formed this band. And I was just going to blanketly ask you that question, but you have such a great description of it. Again, it shows how well you write. I thought, I'm just going to have you read it.
All right.
So it starts here, and you can see all my notes, and goes there,
Okay.
and I can
I
you
skip
can
the
read
notes?
through that.
Okay. The story of the first meeting between Bob Weir and Jerry Garcia is a matter of lore to Deadheads, repeated in the expectant chatter before concerts a million times. Dates and details hazy, but essentially understood. It was New Year's Eve, 1963, and Weir was wandering down the alley behind Dana Morgan's when he and a companion heard the sound of a banjo. They set out in search of the source and found a shaggy character practicing the instrument while waiting for a student to arrive for his lesson. My friend and I apprised him that no one was likely to show up as it was New Year's Eve, Weir remembered. Garcia, nonplussed, noted that he had a key to the shop's instrument room and invited Weir to join him there. We played for hours and realized we had enough half-talent to start a jug band. Weir was young and impressionable, more than any other member of what was soon to become the Dead. Weir was open to being formed by it. He arrived with a jug, and he was ready to learn the rest. That was the beginning of Mother McCree's. It was, Garcia boasted, a fine jug band. Its early performances attracted some modest notice, and within a month or two, Mother McCree's was performing at the top of the Tangent, a Palo Alto club. The audience one night included a dazzled young drummer. That was to prove lucky, as Mother McCree's was solid on banjo, vocals, guitar, and kazoo, but weak on drums. It was an amazing night, Bill Kurtzman recalled. Right then, I became the first Deadhead because I said, I'm going to follow this guy, Garcia, forever. Do you want me to keep going?
No, that was good. So
he did, by the way, yes.
and they had a number of different bands with a number of different names. They seem to stick with one called the Warlocks. And then they find out, there's somebody else called the Warlocks.
Right.
And they had to come up with a new name. How'd they come up with the Grateful Dead?
The Grateful Dead make more good decisions for random reasons than any other institution I've ever run across. And in this case, high on LSD, of course, legal at the time, I will stress, for your sake, Justice. They opened a dictionary at random. Garcia opened a dictionary at random and saw an entry describing the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead there are many forms of the myth of the Grateful Dead. It exists in a lot of ancient literature. The basic storyline is that a traveler is in need of help, and someone provides them that help, and then when the person who provides the help dies and is in need of help transitioning to the underworld, the traveler who was helped helps the former helper to make this transition, and that's known as the gift of the Grateful Dead. Garcia and Phil Lesh loved it immediately. Garcia used to say later that it had enough mythos to be intriguing and deep, and was scary enough to frighten parents who learned that their kids were interested in it. So he took to it right away. Not everyone did. Not even all the members of the band loved it right away. Bill Graham, the famous promoter in San Francisco for many years, hated it. He thought it was too ghoulish. But once Lesh and Garcia were sold on it, it stuck, and of course over time it stuck quite well. But that is how they came up with it for the first time.
So we have to talk, you mentioned LSD, which was legal at the time, so we have to talk about that and the impact that had on the Grateful Dead. But tell us about, you mentioned Ken Casey, the pranksters, and what's so interesting are acid test festivals. So kind of tell us about that aspect.
Yeah. Again, with this moment of real literary flourishing in the San Francisco Bay Area, one of the elements of that literary society was Wallace Stegner, the writer who ran a writing program at Stanford. And one of his students was Ken Kesey, who, by the way, did not get along with Stegner. If you read Stegner's official biography, I think I mentioned this in the book, if you read Stegner's official biography, it lists the writers who he tutored over the years, and he leaves out Kesey. He really didn't like him. And among other things, he didn't like Kesey's experimentation with drugs. But Kesey was, notwithstanding Stegner's disapproval, on his way to a magnificent, if short, writing career. He was writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest at the time. He finished it around the time he met Garcia. It did very well, and of course led to his second and other great novel, Sometimes Great Notion, which he wrote a few years later. Kesey was living in Palo Alto and discovered drugs while working at the VA, discovered LSD specifically while working at the VA there in Palo Alto, and became infatuated with it and with what he regarded as the sort of mind-expanding possibilities that it brought. Among other things, he created what became known as the acid tests, which were essentially parties where LSD was offered for free in the punch. People would pay $1, and they would get high and listen to music. And the music was the music of the Grateful Dead. The Dead, who had become friendly with Kesey, performed at all of the acid tests. And it's an important moment in California history. It also takes place simultaneous to the Reagan campaign for governor. So you really have two very different Californias playing out in 1966, 65 and 66. Among the things I think that are important for the band, for the development of the Dead in the acid test, is that they developed a relationship with their audience that's really unlike any other in music. People did not come to the acid test to listen to the Grateful Dead. They came to experience the acid test, and the Dead played. And sometimes they would play the whole time. Sometimes they would play a few songs and then just stop. Other people would play their instruments at times. And in between, they were just part of the overall event. So
they didn't even play on a stage.
Usually there was no stage. Some of the later ones, they were more elevated, but yes, often they were just really part of the crowd. And so that idea of kind of breaking the barrier between audience and performer was formative for the Dead. That's what they grew up with. And so that's, I think, an important piece of the development of the Grateful Dead through the acid test. The other is the LSD itself. This idea that they would play very long instrumental pieces. They would listen to each other. They felt unbound by the kind of pop sensibilities of the day. All of that grows out of the acid test. I don't really think there is a recognizable Grateful Dead had they not taken root in the acid test.
And you talked about the pranksters and Mountain Girl. Tell us a little bit about that.
She's a great character, and still is. Mountain. The pranksters are the group of mostly writers and artists of different types who sort of gather around Kesey. And it's interesting, actually. I say gather around. I should qualify that. People think of Kesey as the central member of the Merry Pranksters. That's in some ways really not true. He's the one who talked the most, and he's the most celebrated writer. But within the pranksters, he was not really regarded as the leader of the pranksters. But they are this collection of artists who were associated with Kesey, who came to public recognition mostly through Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, which is about the pranksters, and they all had nicknames. So there was Fetchin' Gretchen, and who was pretty. There was the Mountain Girl, of course. Mountain Girl, big, fun personality. She grew up on the East Coast, came to California, was living in Palo Alto. Met Kesey after being introduced by Neil Cassidy, who is the character on whom Moriarty is modeled, or who is the model for Moriarty from On the Road. So On the Road, Neil Cassidy links the beats to the pranksters quite literally. She met him at a coffee house in Palo Alto, St. Michael's Alley. He took her up to meet Kesey. They got along well enough that she had Kesey's daughter while he was married to somebody else. She then later married Jerry Garcia, who helped raise the daughter Sunshine. It's a very complicated family tree. But she was this big, fun, vivacious personality at the center very much at the center of the pranksters, and later very much at the center of Jerry's life.
So I know this is going to seem like a question out of the blue, but it's something I didn't know about. Why was Jerry Garcia interested in the Watts Towers?
Oh yeah, it's a good observation. There's something called the Watts acid test, which was actually in Compton, but it's forever to be known that way. At the end of the Watts acid test the acid test could be fun and enlightening, but they also could be very strange. And this one is famous for the fact that one woman was so overwhelmed by the LSD that she was screaming for much of the evening. And so it was a very disruptive, strange evening. At the end of it, Garcia, still high, and the rest of the band went to see the Watts Towers. I don't know if any of you have seen them in LA. They're very odd structure and the work of this very idiosyncratic, obsessive artist who put them together by hand over many years. Garcia was mostly impressed by them as a model of what he didn't want to do. He didn't want to create some edifice that would stand and be sort of a tribute to a work of someone who was long dead. He wanted the experience. He wanted his artistic experience to be live and interactive with people. He wanted to play with others. It's one little side note. Jerry Garcia only played one concert ever by himself. He always liked to play with others. He hated the one event he did by himself. So that interaction, that idea that, again, the relationship to audience, the idea that audience and performers move each other, that they work with each other, there's a kind of energy transfer, and the life in the moment of it, the zen of it, all impressed Garcia as a way to live in contrast to the Watts Towers. So while the towers themselves are they can be awe-inspiring, in his case, they really stood as a negative example.
So like the Beatles, who I think played in, I think that's called the Cavern, for night after night, for month after month, for hours and hours, somewhat like a Grateful Dead concert. The Grateful Dead kind of did the same thing. I think they played at a place called Magoo's and other places around San Francisco, and they kind of adopted the same thing. They'd play 5 nights in a row. They'd play for hours and hours. And that then evolves into these unbelievably large concerts and kind of going around the country and to Europe and other places. So tell us what their genre of music was.
Good question. Sometimes it's referred to as acid rock or psychedelic rock. That's really is not a good name for it. Garcia used to say, we don't play acid rock. We play traditional music. We just play it under the influence of acid, and that's true. A lot of it is gospel, blues, jazz. They are sort of more properly thought of, I think, as a jazz band in terms of their approach to music than a pop music band. They are famous for never playing the same show twice. They would arrive without a set list. They usually had a song or two in mind that they would cover. Sometimes they had the opening number in mind. But they wanted to listen to each other and to improvise their way through shows. It is part of the reason why people would see so many shows. I know, remember here, you got 300, was that it? 312, or here we go, that's a winner so far. So people would go to see lots of shows. And one of the things that's true about the business model, if you can call it that, of the Grateful Dead, is it doesn't really matter if you play to 4 million different people or if you play to the same million people 4 times each. It's the same number of tickets, right? So as a business model, it works, again, sort of inadvertently. But it is, each of the band members had a different musical background. Each of them brought their sensibility to the band. Their musical appreciation and sensibility was actually much more important, especially early on, than their musicianship. Phil Lesh, who played the bass the entire history for the Grateful Dead, arrived not knowing how to play the bass. Garcia just wanted him in the band. He was a classical composer, and Garcia wanted him in the band because he liked him and thought he was really interesting. So he agreed to play as long as Jerry would teach him how to play the bass, which he did. So it is a fusion of many different American musical styles into something that really doesn't have much to compare it with, I think.
So for those here who haven't been to a Grateful Dead concert, can you tell us a little bit what that experience would be like without the LSD? Well, Dead shows were famously long. A typical show, by the time I was seeing the band, this may be, you saw them earlier than I did, but my first shows were in the late 70s. And there was a sort of, I wouldn't call it a formula, but kind of an expectation. The first set was individual songs. There would be a break, and then after the break, the second set would be more or less a continual piece of music, a couple of songs, but long periods of what was referred to as space, of musical improvisation, sometimes sound, just random, sometimes electronic sound, drums, and those would all segue sort of one into the next, and that would constitute the second set. A Dead show, I guess the shows I saw typically ran sort of 3 to 5 hours, probably. That's enough time, not to get down the drug path here, but it's enough time for your drugs to wear off. So there's a little bit of a safety element there. I don't think that's how they designed it exactly, but people have made the observation that the structure of a Dead show is in some ways like an LSD trip, and that it starts in a kind of organized way. It gets very indecipherable for a while, and then it resolves into something where you have a sense of vision or progress. And so, again, I don't think the shows were not designed to mimic an acid trip, but the fact that they were under the influence of acid as this all came together is probably not a coincidence. And what's so interesting is it wasn't your typical concert at all, like a lot of us have maybe been to, where you go and you sit in a chair and stand up and sit down.
It was not that.
The crowd's divided into different groups of people. So tell us about the Spinners.
Yeah. There's lots of. Someone described a Dead show as like a mandala, and that where each section of the painting has something else happening. The Spinners were a strange and, to my mind, slightly annoying bunch of people who would spin. They would just start spinning at the beginning of the show, and they would do it for hours and hours. And they worked themselves into sort of a trance state. People have suggested that there's a Sufi tradition being expressed, but I think they're just weirdos, frankly. But so I don't think it really has its roots in that. Oddly, the Spinners, they have a strange history, because then they sort of formed frankly, a cult that then dissolved in some accusations of sexual improprieties by the leader of the cult. Anyway, it got very messy. But the Spinners were one recognizable part of that mandala. Beyond that, there were what they called deaf heads, deadheads who couldn't hear, who would hold, you would see them because they would hold balloons to feel the vibrations of the music. The wharf rats is a sober group of deadheads I'm a member of, for what it's worth.
Tell us who they were, what the wharf rats were.
The wharf rats were, they are now, I think, based mostly in San Francisco. They were all around the country or would go to shows. Sometimes they would have an AA meeting at intermission during the shows.
Because they were sober.
Because they were sober.
Tell us about the tapers.
And the tapers. Probably the most lasting and influential of the subcultures of the Grateful Dead subcultures, I guess that's a subculture, are the tapers. The Dead made a decision fairly early in the life of the band to allow people to record shows. That was very much a departure. It continues to be an aberration in the music industry. The theory in the music business is you don't let people tape shows because if they tape shows, they won't buy your albums because they've already got the music. The Dead, well, first of all, they had taped other bands. They had no objection. Jerry used to say, I'm done. When I'm done with the music, I don't care what people do with it. I'm there to perform it, and then you can do whatever you want with it. So people began to record shows. The only reason that caught the Dead's attention, and this shows up in the minutes of the Grateful Dead Corporation, the only reason it really came to the band's attention is that the tapers could be difficult to be around. They would shush people. They didn't want people making noise or bumping their equipment.
And they had all kinds of big...
And they would, well, especially in later years, the Dead's response to this was to create a section where tapers could sit, and they could bring any equipment they wanted. And then they would bring really elaborate equipment because they could. So big boom mics and heavy decks. The Dead did police their copyright. There were a few instances where people would press records and sell them, and the Dead would take action against them. But as long as tapers were just trading tapes among themselves, the Dead had no objection to it. Almost all cassette. There were a few reel-to-reel, but almost all cassette tapes. Some of them very prized. We had it when I was in college. We had a Phil Speck tape, a soundboard tape that we must have listened to a fucking million times. I'm sorry. These tapes were,
it's
there was
okay, you're amongst dead.
I appreciate it. So they were, that became a culture. Not only did it not detract from album sales, the Dead never was really that successful with albums, frankly, but it generated enthusiasm for shows. So the Grateful Dead changed the musical business model, really, to one that's much more familiar today, which is that in those days it used to be that bands would tour to promote an album, and they made the money on the album. The Grateful Dead never really made much money on the albums. They made their money touring, and tapers didn't hurt the touring business. That had two profound effects. One is that it very much reinforced this notion that every show needed to be different, needed to be improvised, because they wanted people to come over and over again. That's a really positive effect of that business model. The negative effect is that they couldn't stop. They had this very large family, they considered them family, of crew and spouses and children and ex-spouses and other, et cetera, et cetera. And because the albums weren't enough to support that whole family, they had to keep touring to keep in business. That became really difficult for Garcia as his addiction grew worse. And it's not right to say that he would have lived if they had a different business model. I don't think that's true. But it certainly did make it very difficult for them to stop. And so it acquired a kind of momentum of its own. But it is the result, in some ways, not directly of tapers, but of a business model that included tapers.
So 3 fun facts. Tell us about how Jerry Garcia played in the role of President Nixon's campaign when he was running for president.
That's a piece of trivia right there. Yes, when Nixon ran in 68, is it 68 or 72? I'm forgetting, but in I think it's 68, he had an ad that contrasted the sort of good American kids with bad American kids. And the good American kids was some college student with a crew cut shown on campus, and the bad one was Jerry Garcia. It's just a flash, but when the word sort of the narration is saying something to the effect of the American children who've lost their way or something, and there's Jerry. So he did play a brief starring negative role in the Nixon campaign. Yeah.
They tried an experiment in ESP.
Yeah, a bit of a bust. Yes, they were playing in New Jersey, I believe it was, and there was another audience gathered in New York, 100 miles, 200 miles away, and they were supposed to collectively concentrate on images on the screen, and the other audience was supposed to pick them up. It didn't prove ESP, but it is actually interesting from my perspective. It's the beginning. It's the first instance that I'm aware of the dead being used as a kind of serious template for research. There are now Grateful Dead studies. There's a Grateful Dead Studies Association. I've written 2 academic papers about the Grateful Dead. Who would have thunk? And there are meetings of the association. There are courses taught on the Grateful Dead, on its business practices, et cetera. So the ESP experiment, while a bust as an ESP experiment, is noteworthy, I think, in that it's sort of the first marker of using the dead as the object of kind of serious attempts at serious research.
So we played some music when you were all walking in and sitting from the Grateful Dead. It was a little hard to hear because you guys were a little unruly, because you're here for a Dead concert. But one of the ones I played was not a Jerry Garcia song. It was Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Teach Your Children.
Yes.
I didn't know until I read your book that he played a role in that song.
He is the steel guitar on that song, which... is by far the thing that people remember the most about the song. I mean, it's a beautiful song overall, but it's a really noticeable lead. And it's one of many uncredited or undercredited contributions he made to a lot of music. A lot of the early Jefferson Airplane music, Garcia acted as a producer, sort of engineer, producer on those albums. On those, he couldn't take credit because he was under contract with a different label. The Dead, though, was Garcia in particular, but the Dead generally were very generous with with bringing up other artists and promoting other work. Again, their band meeting minutes talk a lot about bands they want to bring on to open for them, which is a real ticket to fame and stardom. Years and years ago, when I was at the LA Times, I was doing a story about East LA and the efforts to incorporate East Los Angeles, and I was interviewing one of the members of Los Lobos. And he asked me, he said, "How did you ever hear about us?" And I said, "I saw you warm up for the Dead." And he said, "Oh man, that really changed our lives." So in a lot of ways, both contributing musical performances and promoting acts that they were, that they thought highly of, they were very influential and as a result, very well liked by other musicians.
So listen to it in your car on the way home or when you get home, because it's a
great.
song we've all heard 1,000 times. We've heard that, and
Yeah.
It's really, because he was an amazing guitarist.
He's an amazing guitar player. To a fault. Yeah.
So what does Jerry Garcia have to do with ice cream?
Jerry Garcia, one of my many fun interviews for this book was with the CEO of Ben & Jerry's, where we talked about the history of Jerry Garcia. Ben & Jerry's invented Jerry Garcia ice cream without ever asking Jerry's permission to do that. They put it all together, started manufacturing the ice cream, sent him a bunch in the mail, which is the first he heard of it. His comment at the time was, he said I'm glad it's not motor oil anyway. And he had no problem with them using his name on it. The lawyer for the band had a little more of a problem for it than he did. He wrote a letter to Ben & Jerry's saying, you really do need his permission to use his name on this. So rather than fight it out, they just cut him in for royalty. They won't publicly disclose what it varies from year to year, of course, depending on the sales, but it remains one of their 2 biggest selling ice creams ever. And Jerry used to say later in life that he wished he could retire from the Grateful Dead and just live on the ice cream money, which he probably could have, because by all estimates, it was somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000 a year. So that's a lot of money to have your name on a bucket of ice cream.
So we have to talk about the end, and we have to talk about Jerry Garcia and drugs and heroin. I mean, and really from the beginning, drugs and alcohol were intimately involved. You even talk about one time Mickey Hart, they had to tape him into his drum stool because he was so intoxicated he couldn't sit straight up.
There's some bad stories, yeah.
But tell us about Jerry Garcia and heroin. Drugs and the Grateful Dead are inextricable. There is no avoiding, nor do I have any desire to avoid the topic of drugs, but they are very formative, as we talked about the acid test, certainly. I would say early on,
the drugs were not particularly damaging, or at least from the outside. The drugs early on were mostly marijuana and LSD. In fact, the Dead had kind of an opprobrium around heroin. Mountain Girl used to check visitors at their San Francisco house for tracks and not let people in who had tracks, because she really was opposed to the idea of heroin. So heroin was actually frowned on in Dead circles. It was considered sort of it would make you out of it. Instead of hyper attentive or creative, it would just induce a sort of torpor. One result of that is it's difficult to know exactly when Jerry started using heroin, because he hid it from people. But sometime in the mid-'70s, he began to use. He said later he believed it was Persian smoking opium or something. He made up some idea of what it was that he thought it was instead of heroin. It's a little hard to swallow, frankly. It seems pretty obvious that he would have known that it was heroin. But in any case, at some point, it went from something surreptitious to something, as it often does, something very central to his life. There are a few periods where he got clean. He was busted in San Francisco in Golden Gate Park. I remember growing up thinking, who is the police officer who arrested Jerry Garcia? That just struck me as outlandish, but that was a long time ago. He would get clean occasionally. He'd lose a lot of weight. He was great in periods. It's not a story of everything is fine, he starts using heroin and he drops off a cliff. It's much more up and down than that. But by the late 80s, or in 1986, I went to a show in Washington, D.C. It was scorchingly hot. And afterward, Garcia, it was the last show of their tour. He flew back to San Francisco the next day, and he fell into a coma the day after that. Although it was not solely drug-related, the drugs had clearly depleted him. And then by the 90s, he was really deeply into it. He did try to get help on a couple occasions. He came to the Betty Ford clinic here, didn't like it, checked himself out, went back home up to Northern California, probably used that weekend, checked himself into rehab up in Northern California, and then died the next day. He did not die of an overdose, as you'll sometimes see reported. He died of heart failure. But he was 53 years old, and he had a long history of heroin use and junk food addiction, and he treated himself very poorly for many years. So the drugs were certainly a major contributing factor to that. And I guess the last thing I'll say about the drugs, the thing that makes me saddest, and we talked about this a little over lunch, but not only did he die at a young age and deprive himself and the rest of the world of what he might have done with those other years, but it also meant that he spent his last few years terribly isolated. A person who had built this community, on non-parallel community that he loved, that he was very much at the center of, he alienated himself from it with his isolation and his addiction in his later years. I interviewed a woman who dated him for a long time, who would describe him. She lived in New York City, and so she would describe him at Madison Square Garden performing. She would be waiting outside in the limo. She'd hear the last sounds of the music, and he would be in the car and out of the venue before the lights even came up in the auditorium. He just was on. He just wanted nothing to do with it. And I just find that terribly sad because he took so much joy in that at the height of his life. To have lost that in his later years, I think it was really quite tragic. So
we just have a minute or two, and I want to end and ask if you would read from there to there.
Oh, goodness, yeah, this is a hard one, but let me find my glasses. Here we go. All right, yeah, this is from the very end of the book. If I knew the way, I'd take you home. Robert Hunter wrote that in 1970, and Jerry Garcia sang it for years. The line from Ripple can be heard as a statement of futility. I would take you home if only I knew the way. Or of generosity. I'm offering to take you home. But it also stands as a statement of acceptance, of community and love. I am here to help. Garcia sang that with conviction, with the self-awareness to realize that he did not know the way. He had no plan, no charted path. Instead, he let the currents of meaning flow through him. He gave up some piece of his ego, and he allowed the universe to work through him to magical effect. Perhaps that is where the counterculture comes to rest as well. At its most instructive, a culture that challenges authority and celebrates beauty does not teach us how to overthrow a government. It guides rather than directs. It offers another way. It demonstrates that we have the freedom to explore the world, to give proof of the fact that humans need not attack one another to discover ourselves, that we need not hate or denigrate to be fulfilled, that we may act with compassion and care for one another, that we may feel rather than merely reason, that we may be part of something larger, that we may be free, and that music may help to get us there, and that when we surrender ego, even a bit, magic is at the door. It doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't always work even for those who come to accept it. It doesn't have to. Like a dead show, it works in moments, and it's magnificent when it does. Garcia did not know the way, and he was often lost, but he took us home.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure. Thank you all.